Hi, my name is C.G. Robinson, and we're here at the DePaul Art Museum in the mini collection show that was student ran. I'm also the exhibition design tech prep intern, and we're going to be having a conversation about the Adam Pendleton piece that's behind us. Its title is Untitled for Julius Eastman. And next to me I have Kayla Hodge and Dr. Simone Johnson. And they're just joining me today to kind of talk about the importance of the piece, the significance of the piece, and the piece within this context, and I guess the subject matter in past contexts, and more about Adam Pendleton as an artist and Julius Eastman as a musician. Kayla Hodge is a writer, artist, and second-year student in DePaul's Critical Ethnic Studies program. She received her undergraduate degree from DePaul in WGS and art history. Her academic areas of interest are Black feminism, arts activism, and archival methods of research. She is also the assistant for the CES program, a delegate here at the museum, and a former fellow at the DePaul Art Museum as well. For her studies, her research, teaching, and community-based work is rooted in Afro-Indigenous philosophies and traditions of healing, restoration, and transformative justice. Her scholarship in Anthropology News, the annual review of anthropology and environment and society, applies a social, cultural, and spiritual analysis of Black, queer, feminist, community, ritual practice, and liberation work in the U.S. So that's some background on these two awesome people. As for Adam Pendleton, whose work this is behind us, he is an African-American conceptual artist known for his artistic style that incorporates mixed media practices as well as multidisciplinary frameworks. Technically speaking, his works tend to involve painting, silkscreen, collage, video, performance, as well as word art. His work often involves the investigation of language and the recontextualization of history through appropriated imagery. Adam Pendleton has also described himself as a Dada artist affiliated with Dadaism or the modern Dadaist movement, even writing a Black Dadaist manifesto in 2008 where he states, "History is an endless variation, a machine upon which we can project ourselves and our ideas. That is to say, it is our present moment." Inspiring what the MoMA website describes as the beginning of his Black Dada project that focuses on a theoretical framework inspired by two texts, Dada Manifesto by Hugo Ball, and Anne-Marie Baraka's poem, Black Dada Nihilismus. Julius Eastman, the artist that this piece was inspired by, was an African-American composer and musician. While Julius Eastman has a background in many different genres of music, he was and is well known for his minimalist classical piano pieces, being one of the first pioneers of what many musicians know as organic music. Julius Eastman himself explains that this sound involves gradual choral accumulation, often followed by gradual disintegration, which essentially is the process of playing acoustic instruments through a free-form or free-flowing process, usually with the intention of evoking one's personal emotion. While recognized mildly during his life for his trailblazing work, Eastman was often outcast due to his artistic choices as a Black and gay classical music pianist, an intersection of identities that left him as the minority within these spaces he was a part of. Eastman made many unique creative choices, most notably being the choice to title his work with slurs. Slurs specifically directed to the identities that he held. When he died in 1990 at age 49, his legacy was diminished and ultimately forgotten. It was not until recently where many artists belonging to many different mediums and identities recovered his legacy and made it a mission to ignite a resurgence of his music for the mainstream. So that was some bios for everyone and everything we will be talking about today. So I guess my first question to the both of you was, we've talked about this kind of casually, but I'm interested to know what your initial reaction to the piece was when you saw it, and more specifically, before you got the context of who both of these artists were and kind of where they were coming from, just your initial ideas when you saw the piece, because it's a very delicate subject. It obviously has a slur on it. It's obviously a slur that our identities are affected by.
Yeah, so for me, I have to say there wasn't a point where I saw the piece and didn't know the artist was Black, so I have to say I knew that it was being used intentionally and not in like a white supremacist random way. So for me, I think I was very attracted to it almost because of the boldness of that. I think I appreciate not shying away from histories of racial oppression and being very upfront and honest and like in your face about that. I really appreciate that across just writing and art and all those things. So that's what it kind of evoked for me. So I kind of instantly was drawn into it. And I also love the abstraction as well. So both of those just made me want to like look at it for a really long time.
Yeah, thank you. It's certainly provocative, right, and jarring, right, but also to your point, Kayla, I think quite familiar, right, and I was also aware, right, this was a Black artist, which provides the necessary context for how you receive the work. There's also like a subtle anxiety, right, because I'm also aware, right, that this piece of art has a wide audience, and I guess there's an anxiety about its interpretation outside of myself, right? So it's familiar to me in a particular way, and it has a certain function in my life, right, like as a Black person. But I think with any kind of artwork that is like racially evocative, right, it does stir up, I think, some uncomfortable feelings, right? So I think I held all of that, right? In addition to just like also thinking it was a beautiful piece, right? So, you know, you can also look beyond the text, right? To just like appreciate like the work itself, right? And the way that it's clearly like evoking something for the artist in terms of his own kind of emotional state and relationship to his own identity, right? In terms of form and the content itself.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with those two things. I remember having to photograph it when we first got it kind of in our possession, or at least when I got it in my possession, because it wasn't like within the database, and I was kind of like, what's going on? Like, I kind of remember taking a step back. I mean, I don't think I necessarily had a negative or a positive reaction when I first saw it. I was more so kind of like emotionally like winded when I had seen it, because I think it kind of has this way of taking you over in a sense if you have zero context. And I think that's very intentional, and I think that also kind of creates this journey of figuring out who both of these artists are, which I also think was a really beautiful experience that I got to have, because before that I had briefly heard about Julius Eastman, but not in the way that I would have ever been able to like know of him if I hadn't seen this. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. So we both, well, all of us, we did some digging on Julius Eastman, kind of like how I described, and we kind of talked about his choice, his word choice, the diction, because for many that don't know, this piece is titled after a Julius Eastman piano piece that has the same name. And it's kind of in homage to him as an artist, it's in remembrance to him as an artist. And so when I was kind of doing research, and you guys as well, about him and his choice to title his work what he chose to title it, he kind of described his choice of slurs, but specifically the N-word, as that thing which is fundamental, meaning like it's fundamental to American history, it's fundamental to the American economy. Kind of, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for enslavement and us as in African American people, but America wouldn't look like or function the way that it does if it wasn't for the bloodshed that our ancestors kind of have to go through. So, not kind of did go through. So, I'm kind of wondering, with that context being in mind, that he was kind of coming from this politically charged place as a musician at the time. Did that give the piece a new meaning for you, or did that kind of add some more, I guess, context for you?
Right, so the Julius Eastman piece, right, that this artwork is referring to is Crazy Nigga, right, that precedes then Evil Nigga and then Gay Gorilla, right? And so I think there is like a story being told across these three pieces. And I think for me, when I was initially listening, I had such an empathetic experience with the piece because I immediately understood what he meant, right? By not just the use of the slur, but crazy and evil, right? Because I think it really speaks to the ways that Blackness has historically been linked to deviance, right? In a variety of forms, and what that produces for Black people internally, right? It can produce a kind of madness, which you do get a sense of, certainly in the first piece, which has a certain kind of like anticipatory anxiety, right, in its tone, which then kind of evolves by the time we get to Gay Gorilla into this kind of like almost liberatory tone, right, that is kind of symbolic of this kind of reclaiming, right, because it's reclaiming the subversion that has been kind of like projected onto Black people as like social outcasts. And so, yeah, those are all the things I was thinking about as I was listening to the piece, and then also upon reflection with that, with like viewing the artwork itself.
Yes to all of those things. I agree with. And yeah, I think also there was this, I'm thinking about the slur and it being considered foundational to Eastman, and also the piece and this sort of cyclical nature of it. It feels like it's constantly coming back around. It's constantly like going up and going down, and like, but also coming back around to this same, like Simone was saying, this anxiety, and that persists through all of those changes. And I think that really is like emblematic of kind of like what like the Black American story in our existence within this country is, and it remains foundational, like even as we try to like move beyond it, as we try to like rewrite history, which is a very like prevalent thing right now. It remains foundational, it remains basic, and almost not quite neutral, but just is, you know, it is a thing that has become, or that is in being and continues to be. And so yeah, just like that assertive kind of cyclicalness of it, I think really relates to a Black American experience, and then also having to assert yourself as well, and being a Black gay man in classical music, and like what that looks like, probably the cycles of embracing identity and then also feeling, you know, isolated, like it does continuously feel like this never-ending fight that we engage in with identity and with racism.
I have, after hearing you guys kind of talk about that, I have two questions, more technically speaking, to both the Julius Eastman piano piece and also this visual artwork behind us. I'm really interested in knowing y'all's thoughts on how they compare to each other, artistically speaking, how the musical language can compare to the visual language of this piece, and kind of vice versa, where they compare and also where they contrast. And I also want to ask you both after that, how do you think that this Dadaist framework that Adam Pendleton is coming from impacts I guess, how we engage with Julius Eastman's music and how we engage with Julius Eastman's titles within the context of this piece as well. So
I think I can start with a comparison of the pieces and how they kind of work together. When I was looking at Adam Pendleton's process and kind of how he paints and creates, he described it as being very like gestural. And I could kind of almost, when I was listening to the Julius Eastman piece and envisioning, okay, Adam Pendleton potentially like painting to this music, you know, it feels like it has that, you know, sporadic, you know, anxious, sharp, and also very layered and subverted kind of feel to it. So yeah, I think just in a kind of like meta way of like thinking about like the two existing together, I definitely see that like the swirling, the layering, the things being hidden and visible at the same time. Like I get those same kinds of feelings from them, both of the pieces. And yeah, also maybe just like the element of kind of composing maybe. I'm thinking about like the gesture of composing and like that being sort of similar to the gestures that he's potentially using when spray painting and doing all of that. So yeah, it feels, the painting feels very musical, all that to say. And then the second part of the, well here, I'll let Simone speak to that and then we can come back to that part.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think we get to see both artists in process. With the gestural kind of nature of Adam Pendleton's work, and then with the kind of like simplicity and repetition of Julius Eastman's work, where we really get to get a sense that he's kind of like working out this composition, right? It's almost as if he's playing it for the first time, right? And trying to, find a kind of like organization to the piece, and then it kind of resolves itself in the end, right? So there is kind of intention behind it, right? But I think with both artists, and I think it's really representative of what like Dada is all about, right? Like as an aesthetic form, it is very much about process, right? Even above like this idea of like a final product, right? Because I think it really is a commentary on the fact that like we're all always in process and like evolving and changing and in between states of being, which I think both of these pieces like really articulate well.
I don't know.
So yeah, maybe repeat that.
Yeah, so I know I like kind of like mended them two together. Did not need to do that, but the second question is kind of like how does Dadaism or like a Dadaist framework, I guess kind of changes the way that we engage with Julius Eastman's music and kind of how, I mean, what does it say about this piece that Adam Pendleton is a Dadaist artist who's using a classical Black musician's piece to kind of like make this political, mental, emotional like point? How do they all kind of connect, and what does that bring up for you?
I think one of the central kind of like philosophies around or ideologies around Dadaism is like the point is to point out the absurdities of reality, right? And like if we're talking about this slur, which we've talked about has all of this like historical import and has had all of these consequences, right, in its use, I think there is a relationship between the two artists in that in the Julius Eastman piece, he's really highlighting like Black deviancy, as I was saying before, and really having a conversation about kind of external projections of identity and what that does to one's internal life, and the decision one makes internally to then kind of subvert this master narrative, in this case around this particular word, right? And that's where like the reclaiming comes in, right? Because we talked earlier about how the word is still very much in use, right? And not in a way that has become a part of Black culture, you know, for better or for worse, right? And not without controversy to that point even more, which I think is also very Dada, right? To be controversial in the sense that like we are kind of shedding light on the aspects of our society that we often shy away from.
Yeah.
Right?
This is also kind of bringing up for me, that part of what Adam Pendleton, I guess, was like doing when he was deciding to kind of be inspired by these Julius Eastman pieces is almost like a challenge to like an epistemic challenge, really, to kind of the canon, I guess, that's sort of created around these mediums, around, for him, minimalism in a, painting sense, but also for Julius Eastman in a classical sense as well. So I think, yeah, just like being critical of, right, the absurdity that like a composer can't be, Black and gay and like have these multi-layered identities and is expressing this quote unquote deviance. So like it's absurd that it's even considered deviant, and so like sort of challenging the ways I think that the field has kind of like maybe silenced or like sort of suppressed his work and his legacy because it doesn't necessarily suit, what is constantly being expressed through, through these genres. So like, yeah, I think also like bringing back to the forefront something that was, was suppressed and that was sort of like lost to all of these, systems of like oppression and like repression and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah. I feel that with both of these artists, it takes a little bit of time maybe for an audience to figure out what to do, how to place them aesthetically, right? And I think your point about their minimalism, right, is I think really important because I think historically the way it's been understood is that Black people express themselves in maximalist ways.
Yeah.
Right? The polyrhythmic music, the very like colorful, often it's more representational art rather than abstract art, right? It has a political message, right? It's overtly Black in a certain sense, right? And the thing about Black artists in abstraction has been, right, the conversation has always been around whether it is the responsibility of the Black artist to produce work that is explicitly political, right? Hence representational art, right, being, central to the kind of like Black, to kind of the catalog of Black artists. And I would also say that with the music of Julius Eastman, right, the simplicity of it, I think also rejects this kind of tendency to think about Black expression and maximalism together, right? That in that regard, they're both kind of like transgressing that stereotype, and in certain ways situating themselves inside of this historical conversation about the responsibility of the Black artist, or these struggles we've had culturally with like recognizing the Black artist, right, and seeing Black artists as legitimate contributors to art forms outside of those that are political in tone.
Awesome answers from both of you. Great kind of segue into something else I kind of wanted to talk about. Kind of in terms of, I guess, Black creatives who are kind of like outside of, I guess, the stereotype of a Black artist. When we had first like met to kind of talk about this, you brought up a very interesting thing that I really wanted to talk about today, and like in our talk, and also like within this space, was kind of how Adam Pendleton is a Dadaist artist, a Black Dadaist artist, which is a movement that, well, like if you're Black and if you're in the know, like you're familiar with, but I guess in a more general art historian stance, it's not really a movement that has a lot of like, I mean, like Black people don't really get a lot of like screen time when we talk about Dadaism. I mean, I haven't taken the Dadaist class yet, so I don't really know what we're working with, but when we think of Dadaism, we think of the urinal, we think of Duchamp, we think of European artists, we think of all of this very European-centric-esque, things, and kind of like their issues, their struggles, and I mean, there were white American Dadaist artists as well who kind of talked about this stuff, but we very rarely do we get the representation of Black people within Dadaist movements, Dadaist spaces. It's kind of like an underground artistic practice, and I think that with artists like Adam Pendleton, it's getting a lot of more recognition that like there is this subgenre of Dadaism that is kind of intrinsic to the Black experience, and that a lot of Black artists are kind of like, touching upon. And I think similarly to him kind of being one of the few artists in the public sphere kind of labeling himself as a Dadaist artist, as a Black Dadaist artist, how does that compare to Julius Eastman at the time having that label as a Black classical composer? Because, like you said, when we think of Black art, when we think of Black music, we think of maximalism, and we also think of, like jazz, which we, our people were kind of the pioneers of that in this country. So how does that compare to kind of Adam Pendleton being a Dadaist artist in the contemporary time with that kind of like Black representation, and Julius Eastman, Black gay composer, but within the classical music genre and not kind of within the jazz, realm?
I think my initial thought as you were talking was the association of these art forms, in Dada in particular, I guess I can start with modernity.
Yeah.
And it's a modern art form in the sense that it's anti-modern, right? It's a critique of modernism, but if you think about it that way, and you think about the way that Blackness has been understood with relationship to modernity, which is like, Blackness is the antithesis of modernity, right? At the same time that Dadaism was emerging as an aesthetic form, we're still talking about Black folk artists, right? So it's like, Black people aren't recognized, at this historical period as modern subjects.
Yeah.
So it's like, what do we have to say about the project of modernity, right? That these, European artists, right, haven't already said, right, in a certain sense. So I think that, like, any kind of Black critique of modernity, whether that's in literature or art, I think was like highly suppressed, even though it certainly existed, right? And I think now there's like a larger space for that, certainly. And then, with respect to classical music and jazz, right, we were talking in our conversation about how Black people aren't typically associated with classical music because it's seen as this kind of like higher art form, and that it requires a certain level of like intellectual acumen, as opposed to jazz, right, which is without form, and it doesn't have any kind of formal properties, right? That's the misunderstanding of jazz. Of course it has formal elements and properties, right? But the idea is that, Black artists can only express themselves in these kind of ways that are without reason, right? And so I think what Julius Eastman's work does is kind of trouble that notion, right? And I think invites us to see him in process, like I was saying, which also speaks to like the rigor of the work, right? And it's rigor, I think, that's at the heart of certainly this conversation about classical music, right? Because it's like, what does it take to be a classical musician, right? It takes study, right? Meticulous study, right? So to be able to embody that identity as an artist, I think really rejects, those kind of racist notions about what a Black musician is capable of and can produce. So yes,
Yeah, and I think the same kind of is happening with Adam Pendleton as well, in the contemporary space. And I really love that you brought up that aspect of like modernity and like Black people never kind of being seen as existing within that. But then also, like, maybe their work is kind of challenging that notion to say that in fact we are like foundational to this concept of like what modernity is and what that has developed, and our role within that is very significant and, again, not simplistic in a way to be reducing it, but as in it is, and it has to be recognized for exactly, what it is. And I think both of them in their respective fields are trying to challenge that. And I think it's also, I don't know if I would say unfortunately, but they have to kind of label themselves in this, they have to kind of assert the blackness, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, and we were talking about this a little bit, how like, is it redundant to say black gods? Like, is that a redundant concept? Because in theory, like, anti-blackness and racism should be a part of those, like, realities that are surreal, that we should be questioning, and yet it has not still emerged in that space. And so it's like, you almost have to still bring blackness to the front in a way that like maybe people would perceive as kind of like, again, bold and maximalist, but it's like, no, it's just what is necessary for you to understand that like this is also a part of that question. This is also a part of that like critical line of thinking and creating. But again, do they consider black people being able to, be critical in that way? It's like you have to kind of assert that. And like, is that a burden or is that like an opportunity? And I think both of them really turn that into an opportunity. I never personally feel like I need to, or like other artists need to kind of shy away from being explicit about their identity and about using that. Because still in all, it has to be stated. It's the thing that is constantly misremembered and constantly has to be reasserted. Even when you are in like contemporary minimalism or in classical music. Just challenging the ways that like people think black people create in a modern world. So,
No, I agree with the both of you. And I think you brought up a really interesting point about modernity. And you have some awesome comments about that point. I was kind of thinking from kind of an art historian perspective, just kind of the way we talk about black art across the diaspora period is, there's some work that needs to be done. And I wonder if there is kind of a tie between how we, speaking from a diaspora perspective, like, is there a tie between the way that art historians talk about African art history and African art from the continent of Africa, and kind of how it wasn't until recently where a lot of these works weren't considered as artifacts or objects. It is a pretty recent thing that we are able to call them art, And so, very similarly speaking, I wonder, in the next 20 years, are we gonna realize that there were so many African American artists that may have been missed by the artistic canon or whatever? Now, they have their finger on the pulse or something. They were commenting on stuff that was what they're gonna say was ahead of their time, but it was actually so relative to the time where it's like, how could you have missed that? And I think the resurgence with Julius Eastman specifically, I think we're kind of entering that point in artistic musical history where people are going to start to go back, realize that they missed something, or realize that there was something there. And it's able to live on like through these conversations, through this piece, but it also is kind of sad, I think, because while this work is able to exist and live on, it was important within its time, and it should have been upheld within its time for that importance. And I think that is why, on a general scale, we don't have a lot of, Black representation within these non-maximalist or non-stereotypical spaces because people aren't willing to like give it a chance. And I think, and then it's like when, I guess, the art market or I guess the higher powers in charge of like what pops off gives it a chance. It's like all of this rigmarole. Like I think about Basquiat and I think about even with Adam Pendleton now too, where it's like the kind of censorship that I'm assuming that he was going through when he was in these spaces and the reception that he got. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder kind of when I say all of that about kind of the art historian standpoint, do you feel like that there, I feel like I know what you guys are going to say, but like, I guess speak more to the missed opportunity that a lot of artists like Julius Eastman and artists back, like artists like that back then, and also artists, Black artists now throughout this time who aren't getting this kind of, you know, representation. Do you feel like, how can we combat that essentially? Like how can we make sure that people are being sought after and their work is being understood within the context that it's made so that we don't have to go back there? It doesn't have to be two new students and another professor 20 years from now talking about this one great thing that we all missed, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's such like a everlasting question, to be honest. And I think what instantly comes to my mind is that it's worth noting that like a lot of times, even, you know, Adam Pendleton is doing this as well with Julius Eastman, but we have to be the ones to kind of like do that,
Right.
you know, reclaiming, uncovering, and really pushing that to the forefront. Or you know, it has to be. It's almost like it has to be. I don't know. I wonder if that's what they see the value as in the work. If that's what they think the like the complexity of it is. It has to kind of be like lost to time and uncovered. And I think that's but again that goes back to that like pushing Black people out of your concept of modernity.
Right.
And I just wonder if really, I don't know if this is antithetical to maybe what we're trying to do, but I think we always have to be the ones to be making the space for that and to be attentive and vigilant to that. It's like, I'm not sure how we, especially in 2026, and especially in the time that we're in, it's like I'm not sure how we get others to, I mean, aside from like being in this space and doing stuff like what we're doing now, I'm not sure how we get others to understand, but I think it's always important that we're keeping an eye and we're creating those spaces. And again, I think that also shows the utility of being a Black artist in these spaces and saying, I am Black and I am doing this, because I feel like that's almost like a signal to the rest of us to be like, okay, we need to be paying attention to this. Because that's kind of always how we are. It's like, okay, we find out that there are Black people doing great things in this space that like we never had saw, and then it's like, okay, like we're on this now, you know? And I think whether or not the hypothetical others are catching up to that, I won't say it's irrelevant, because I think it is relevant if you are a working artist and you are like just making art for the world. Like it becomes relevant when, you know, when white people or non-Black people are not paying attention, because that affects who's able to see it, how much, you know, money you're making. It affects all of those other things. But I think in terms of like preserving what it means and preserving and creating a cultural space for it, unfortunately we have to be the ones to be like doing that. But like, yeah, I think that's kind of just the time that we're in, is like it's giving our work sounds.
I
It's
like
getting
low-key, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to is like the fact that we have to continue to dig into the archive and connect our contemporary work to this large body of work that has preceded it, to say that we've always been doing this, right? And I think that's part of what Adam Pendleton is doing with his own work, because he's referencing Julius Eastman, right, who has essentially been lost to time, right? And I think it's important to recognize also and acknowledge the fact that Julius Eastman died ill and in poverty, right? And that's to say that our most progressive thinkers and artists are rarely ever appreciated, while they're alive, I'm teaching a Zora Neale Hurston class right now, so that's like certainly top of mind, right? It's like we are constantly having to like excavate our past to search for our lost ancestors, right? Like in a very real sense, right? That in their time went unacknowledged, misunderstood, right? And so, yeah, I think the work that we're doing now is extremely important, right? And I think we need to continue to dig into the archive, continue to have these retrospectives, and continue to have these intergenerational conversations that allow us to make deeper connections between our contemporary practice and this large repertoire from which it comes, right? Because we're not the first people to have this conversation. We're not the first people, Adam Pendleton's not the first Dada artist, right? Even though he might be the first person to claim that, but certainly the form has always existed, right? So naming that, I think, is really powerful and important.
Awesome, guys, thanks. I want to ask one more question about the technical aspect of this piece before we start talking about the censorship, the elephant in the room. Graffiti is a really big thing in this piece. It's definitely the thing that I love the most about it. I love the choice that he did spray paint and graffiti, and I have kind of two questions about that. How does that affect the reception of the piece, the subject matter of the piece, and also the cultural significance of graffiti? I think is something that we should definitely talk about, especially with graffiti within a highbrow context like the museum. And second, the choice to use graffiti when honoring a classical musician. How does that juxtaposition kind of speak to the broader meaning?
I can definitely speak to that first part. And I was thinking about this earlier, like, I mean, graffiti is graffiti, right? But also, is graffiti Dada? Like, because, like, okay, to my earlier point, right, like, we have to dig into the archive and, like, start reclaiming this practice that has always existed within our, creative practice. And that also includes, like, reframing the way we think about these art forms that we don't typically associate with, these categories of thought or aesthetic practice. So that's to say, right, like, if, as I was saying before, Dada is concerned with pointing out the absurdities of reality, if it is concerned with abstraction, right, like, certainly graffiti falls into that, right, because it is very explicitly, like, it's work that has a certain kind of, like, message attached to it, right? There's a social commentary being made, which is, like, kind of the whole point, right? And that's the point of Dada, right? So I think Adam Pendleton is doing something really interesting there. I mean, at first I was thinking, I appreciated the graffiti because of, like, the gestural aspect, as we were talking about before, but also him connecting that to Dada, I think, is really significant, and is kind of, claiming a stake, right, even further, right, and making a claim, rather, that, like, other graffiti artists are a part of this kind of school of artistic practice, right, that has, the kind of the same objective, right, which is to talk back to the world, right, and often it's on the very object, graffiti in life is on the very object it's trying to make a comment on, right? And so to your second question about what do I make of that, you know, decontextualized graffiti, right, that exists within a gallery space, right, where we would alternatively see it on the street, right? Like it has a different resonance, perhaps. I don't know what to make of it. I mean, we're looking at a piece of graffiti right here, right now, right, and it's moving me. Certainly, you know, in relationship to what surrounds it, which I think gives it a certain level of respect and regard, right? Because we're seeing it as art that is like worthy to be shown, exhibited, put into conversation with other works of art, right? So,
Yeah, definitely second all of that. And to add, yeah, I really also appreciate the use of the graffiti. And I think for me, when I think about graffiti and its use specifically in the world, out on buildings, and kind of that like one challenging what is space for, what are these buildings for, where can and can't we make art and creatively express. So I've always really kind of loved graffiti for that. And I think, yeah, I think he's pulling in like so many things at once. So it's almost hard to say what is the one kind of takeaway that I have from him using it. But I think, yeah, like bringing it into, one, it being in the context of minimalism, or being used in a minimalist way, as opposed to how we typically see graffiti artworks, which are very like colorful and maximalist in that way. So he's sort of bringing that tradition, the spirit of it for sure, and kind of just using it in a different way. And then, yeah, creating works that are kind of meant to sit in these gallery spaces, in these confined, you know, very structured, you know, spaces that have these sort of like social stipulations very much attached to it, of how we can make art and what we can say and where we can be. It's very different than, you know, making graffiti out in the world. And like, yeah, I think he's definitely trying to bring some of that into this space. I think, I'm like, I don't know how to say more other than it's like bringing that spirit of like challenging space and challenging where art can be made. And yeah, I'm like, the words are failing me, but I'm like, I'm sure that's connected to Black Dog somehow. Yeah, and I feel like, yeah, like you were saying, graffiti in that way is just very Dada. But yeah, that's what I really think about, is like reclaiming space and reclaiming truly like white space.
Thanks, guys. So I kind of want to, for the last part of the talk, kind of talk about the elephant in the room, which is the slur.
Yeah.
The slur at hand. And the concept of censorship. Because it's really been a journey for me in this piece and the title. And I mean, the title was so much of a journey that I forgot that, like, the N-word was in the piece itself. And I was just like, at this point, like, I don't even know what I'm trying to run away from when it's literally gonna be in everyone's face.
Yeah.
And I think the thing for me was, personally, as a lover of art, as a Black person, lover of art, I wasn't personally offended, and I kind of didn't really care about the non-Black perception of it, just because this piece kind of felt like it was kind of for us. I mean, it wasn't explicitly stated, but it was for us in the sense where it's like, we didn't have to give so much extra thought into what this could mean. It just kind of would speak for itself for us, whereas I feel like other people not a part of our demographic would probably need a little extra context, which is totally fine. But with that being said, I think I was just really afraid that like it would be misunderstood and misrepresented and not given the time of day, or kind of be like ostracized as this like super like triggering thing, or we're just kind of being profane for the sake of being profane. And literally the director of DPAM like had to talk me off the ledge multiple times, and like I mean like me and the other interns and you even like we've had so many conversations, and like it was just kind of like a circular conversation where it was just kind of like we have to uphold the rights of the artist, what Adam Pendleton wanted, what he titled it as, there won't be any asterisks. So that was kind of awesome, and it was really awesome to work with a group of people who were so committed to doing that. And it was awesome to be able to write the context for the piece with you to kind of like make sure that it's not being misunderstood. So, with that being said, as two people, one I kind of want you guys to think about like one as your identities outside of your academic professions, outside of like your work. Does this title trigger you, genuinely speaking, and within your context of the profession? Is this title substantial to you? I mean, obviously it's substantial. We're talking about it. We all love it. But kind of within artistic spaces, within the context, is it necessary as a Black professional? Your opinion on that, and just kind of, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely wasn't offended by it. I don't know, something about the words crazy nigger together is affirmative for me. I don't know, does anyone feel that? Like, it's something about it is like, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And like you said, it isn't something that takes much thought for us to kind of understand that like you are kind of it's an acknowledgement of the racism, it's an acknowledgement of the, like you were saying, some of the Black deviance that's placed on us, and sort of like not owning the like your story, but like owning the fact that like what that means for me and what my existence is that is not necessarily what you say it is, and like I don't have to internalize that.
Yeah.
You know, it almost it works in kind of a backwards way for me, which I found really interesting. But yeah, in terms of the censorship, and just also in the context of DePaul, of higher ed, of the country, I feel like it's very, very, very important for us to be having actual conversations about the word, and for us to not shy away from talking about it and using it just because of like offense that might be taken from non-Black people, because really when we think about it, like it's not something that is offensive to them, it's more so an aversion to the depth of what that holds, you know? It's an aversion to like walking into a museum and almost like having to be accosted by, you know, by that history and by everything that encompasses. And I think you should be accosted. Like I think you need to be. And but also to your point, we needed that extra verbiage to go along with it, unfortunately, so that people would understand why it was being used, and not that it's, you know, an endorsement of you know, racist or white supremacist ideas at all. And yeah, I think that we as Black people should be able to use that word and use the variations of that word that we've created, because we understand and have felt all of the brunt of that language. And so yeah, I appreciate for sure that the museum allowed for us to kind of make that call around how to display this, because it is really it's about how we feel about it, most importantly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one could read the piece as sensationalist, to your point. But I think it's pointing out the fact that the commonness of it, right? Like, it's very much a word in use, right? Like, historically, presently. And, you know, I was having actually a conversation about this with my class yesterday around, again, the works of Zorna Hurston and how she was critiqued about her work. And really, you know, contemporary thinkers argue she's just telling it like it is, not the way things ought to be, right? But the way things are, right? Which is kind of what I'm reminded of when I look at this piece. Like, yeah, I mean, I hear people say these exact words just like on the train, down the street, right? And it doesn't particularly faze me, you know? And so, to your question, I understand the piece, right? It is not particularly jarring to me because, yes, this word is like constantly in use, and I understand what the artist is trying to do, which is to say just that, and also to describe the ways that not blackness, but racism itself is maddening and produces a sense of madness. And isn't that crazy inward, right? So in a certain way, we can commiserate, you know, it's a point of connection, the piece is, to say, it's not necessarily to call Black people crazy, but to say, isn't that crazy? Isn't racism crazy, right? And isn't it inducing madness in all of us, right? All of us, not just Black people, right? Right.
No, for sure. I completely agree with the both of you. We also talked about this briefly, but I kind of wanted to zero out a little bit in terms of the censorship and Black artistry and kind of talk about examples in, I guess, either pop culture or even within, like, I guess, art, historic, you know, spaces, just these examples of subversion, and also kind of like the price that a lot of these Black artists pay for like choosing to do things at certain times where maybe it was not the time to be doing it. And I literally, like, the best example I feel like is Julius Eastman versus Adam Hilton. I mean, we're able to have this up right now in an academic setting at our school within the art museum, but people didn't even want to play Julius Eastman's work because they were just so scared of it. They were so uncomfortable by the concept of having to teach a class his work. And I think when I think about that, but then I also think about, I mentioned this, like Kendrick Lamar's To the Butterfly album cover, the reception to that photograph of like a dead president, you know what I mean? And how like conservatives in this country hated him for the longest time. He was like the antithesis of like why rap music is terrible and whatever, which that is like his most culturally significant piece of music up until this point. It was kind of like the price that he had to pay to be able to explain why it was okay for him to depict what he depicted within the context of his work. But then Richard Pryor, who was a big inspiration to Julius Eastman, who was also known for kind of his comedic subversion, but that was kind of like picked up and celebrated by the Black community, and he's still like a source of inspiration for so many different like comedians, you know, televisioners, stuff like that. So I think I obviously know that it is super contextual, like what kind of subversion is celebrated and what might not be. I also do know that it is within the context of kind of, to your point, how many Black people are around during the time to be able to uplift it during the time that it's being made. But I kind of want to ask you guys, like, about this price that Black artists pay to be able to express themselves in these ways that we might understand, intercommunally, but that the wider audience just might not get, and how that could be difficult for them sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a very real phenomenon, I guess you can kind of call it. And I mean, you spoke earlier, Simone, about the fact that, Julius Eastman died, ill and not having financial stability. And like, I think that's often some of what that price is, especially when being an artist is connected to your livelihood. And that's like very immediate and very like devastating. And I think just even thinking about now in this day and age where we have like social media and the internet and all these different things and how that kind of creates, I think it's kind of opened up the space a little bit more for people to be able to express themselves and it find the people that it needs to find, and you're not as sort of beholden to, where you are and what time period and what the, the limitations of that are. I think something that came up in my head when we were talking was Doechie's Crazy, her song Crazy in that music video. I think that's a perfect example of like kind of an artistic work that would be completely like misunderstood. I don't know if anyone's seen the video before, but it has a lot of nudity, a lot of like nude Black women, and like it doesn't really depict violence, but there's like a lot of like guns and things like that, and just sort of a controversial portrayal of like Black women's bodies. Like that, I think would not be something that would have been allowed, to really be depicted at one point. But like now we're in a space where, we digitally kind of have these conversations around like Black feminism and all these things, and so it kind of sets the stage for the people that need to see this and the people who will get this, can get this, and now there's like a different way to like, make a living off of things. Obviously, she's a musician, a very popular one at that, but like, still in all, I think we just live in a different landscape right now that's like hyper connected. And I think that can aid a little bit in Black artists, not having to like experience that ostracization of like where they may be at that moment and who they may be showing it to, because somewhere out there's someone who will get it, and you have the ability to get that to them, which can change everything. So I think that's really cool nowadays, and that's something that really our ancestors just didn't have. But like they had other things in other ways. So like,
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said, that like, certainly like social media allows artists to be able to like access their audience, right, in a way that, and it allows their audience to find them, right? And it doesn't have to be understood by everybody, right? Like, or make everybody comfortable, right? And we were talking earlier about the way that everybody understands what this word means. Right? And it's like, it's not, the art piece isn't meant to like be comforting to us, And I think that's kind of the point as well. Right? So yeah, and otherwise, I totally second what you said.
Okay, well, I have one final question for you guys to kind of wrap us up. And when I look at this piece and I think about kind of like the free-flowing nature of both Julius Eastman's musical pieces and the free-flowing nature of Adam Pendleton, the graffiti and the visual language, do you feel like this work is inherently political or political? do you think that we should view it as political, or should we just view it as self-expression? Or can they both exist at once? I kind of believe, to me, kind of going back off of whether or not we should call ourselves black artists, black power artists, I kind of believe that, like, no matter what you do as a black person, there's always going to be that, like, blackness attributed to it. But I think just within the context of this piece, is it political? Is it self-expression? Is it both? Do you think they had an intention for whether this was kind of like, whether they wanted it to be interpreted as political? Kind of, do you think it matters to them? And yeah, I think that's kind of how I want to wrap it up.
I imagine that certainly there's an awareness that this is going to be really provocative, right? And still, I could say it's probably a little bit of both, right? Like, when the word itself is in use, right? When you use it, or you use it, or I use it in everyday life, is it political, or is it us expressing ourselves, right? But I would argue that the piece is political in that it sparks conversation, right? So at the most basic level, certainly, right? Is it intentional? Perhaps not, right? But I'm certainly probably expected that it would spark controversy, conversation, right? And in that way, I mean, we can just harken back to, you know, the Black feminist wisdom that the personal is political, right? So to me, everything is political, right? So yes and yes, right, for me.
Yeah, I would say the exact same, because I think for me personally, because I've kind of been trained in that Black feminist, lens, I always think of my self-expression as political. I think everything is. I think there's really no such thing as being apolitical. I think even striving for something that's quote unquote apolitical is political. So I think, and I think Adam Pendleton seems very unafraid of like what that means, you know? Like, I think him deciding to label himself as a Black power artist and to make these works with these controversial titles is very much like an embracing of that political nature, because, I can't speak for him, but probably because that's just how we are engaging in our everyday life as Black people. Like, you maybe aren't even consciously thinking of it, and then all of a sudden something becomes like consciously political in that moment.
That double consciousness.
The double consciousness. And so it's like, therefore, I think it always is, but I think that goes for everyone though. I think everyone's, self-expression is political, not just us. But I don't think it's something to shy away from. I think it's a time that we need to be embracing that and embracing our, utilizing our self-expression, because that may be all we have left. That may be all we have left soon, guys. I think it is, and I love that. I think, there's something wrong with it.
Well, thank you guys for joining me to celebrate this piece. So.
Thank you, CG.